In the spring of 1977, Dorothy Granny Dollar woke to find every one of her 200 cattle gone. The sheriff called it a mystery.
Folks around here call it a cover-up.
She called it the day the...
The Indiana Bloodbath of 1977, Granny Dollar slaughtered 21 men who stole her family's cattle, the bloodiest act of rural vengeance in modern American history and the most devastating campaign of retribution the Midwest had ever witnessed. This is the true story of Granny Dollar. Our story begins in the flat farmland of rural Park County, Indiana, known throughout the state for its covered bridges and its stubborn independence. The land here is different from the mountains of Appalachia or the plains of the West, a rolling patchwork of cornfields and pastures and woodlots that has been farmed by the same families for generations. The people who work this land are not given to drama or exaggeration, preferring to solve their problems quietly and to keep their business to themselves. They are practical people, hard-working people, people who believe that a person's word is their bond and that debts must always be paid. You see, in rural Indiana in the 1970s, the old ways were still holding on despite the changes sweeping through America. Farmers still helped their neighbors with harvests, still gathered at the feed store to discuss weather and prices, still trusted handshakes more than written contracts. The young people were leaving for Indianapolis and Chicago, drawn by opportunities that the farms could not provide. But those who stayed maintained traditions that went back to their great-grandparents and beyond. It was a world that was disappearing, and those who lived in it knew it, and they held on to what they had with a fierce determination. The cattle industry in Park County was smaller than in the western states, but no less important to the families who depended on it. A herd of beef cattle represented years of careful breeding, thousands of dollars of investment, and the security of knowing that there would be income when the bills came due. Losing cattle to disease or market fluctuations was hard enough. Losing them to thieves was something else entirely, a violation that struck at the very foundation of a family's livelihood and their trust in the community around them. Cattle theft had been increasing throughout rural Indiana in the mid-1970s, driven by rising beef prices and the anonymity that modern transportation provided. A truck could pull into a pasture at night, load a dozen head, and be across the state line before anyone knew the animals were missing. The thieves were often organized, connected to networks that could move stolen cattle through auction barns and slaughterhouses faster than law enforcement could track them. By 1977, cattle theft had become a crisis that local sheriffs seemed powerless to address. The woman who would become known throughout Indiana simply as Granny Dollar was born Dorothy Mae Henderson in 1907, in the same farmhouse where she would live her entire life. She was called Granny not because she was particularly old when the events of this story occurred, though at 70 she had certainly earned the title, but because she had been a grandmother since her early 40s and had embraced the role with a ferocity that defined her later years. The Dollar name came from her marriage to Harold Dollar in 1928, a union that would last 52 years until Harold's death in 1980. That's right. Dorothy Henderson had grown up on a farm that her grandfather had carved out of the Indiana wilderness in the 1840s, and she had absorbed the values of that harsh, early era along with the skills necessary for survival. She could shoot, could butcher, could do anything that needed doing on a working farm. She had raised 5 children through the Depression and the war years, had buried 2 of them before they reached adulthood, had endured hardships that would have broken a weaker person. By 1977, she was the matriarch of a family that included 3 surviving children, 11 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren, all of whom treated her with a respect that bordered on fear. Her physical appearance belied the steel that lay beneath. She stood 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed perhaps 110 pounds, a small woman with white hair that she kept pinned in a tight bun and hands that were gnarled from 70 years of farm work. Her eyes were her most striking feature, pale blue and sharp as broken glass, eyes that seemed to see through whatever they looked at to the truth beneath. Those who knew her well understood that Granny Dollar was not someone to be crossed, that her small size concealed a will that was absolutely unbreakable. She had been born in a time when women on farms were expected to work as hard as men, and she had met that expectation without complaint. She had plowed fields behind horses before tractors became common, had butchered hogs, and processed the meat without help, had done everything that needed doing without waiting to be asked. The Depression years had taught her to waste nothing, to save everything, to prepare for hard times that might come at any moment. The lessons had stayed with her, shaping a character that was as hard and practical as the land itself. Her marriage to Harold had been a partnership in the truest sense, two people working together toward common goals. They had divided the labor according to their strengths, Harold handling the heavy field work, while Dorothy managed the household and the livestock. She had kept the books for the farm operation, had negotiated with buyers and suppliers, had made decisions that shaped the financial future of the family. When Harold's health began to fail in the 1970s, she had simply taken on more of his responsibilities, refusing to let the operation suffer because of circumstances beyond their control. The community knew her as someone who said what she meant and meant what she said. She did not waste words on pleasantries, did not engage in gossip, did not suffer fools with any patience at all. When she made a promise, she kept it. When she issued a warning, she followed through. People had learned over decades that Dorothy Dollar was absolutely reliable, that her word was her bond, that she would do exactly what she said she would do. This reputation would serve her purposes when she began her campaign. The Dollar farm had been in the family for 4 generations by 1977, a working operation that included 300 acres of cropland and pasture and a herd of registered Angus cattle that represented the family's most valuable asset. The cattle operation had been built over decades, each generation adding to the breeding stock, improving the bloodlines, creating a herd that was known throughout the county for its quality. The registered bulls alone were worth more than most people's houses, and the breeding cows represented an investment that could not be easily replaced. Harold Dollar had managed the cattle operation for most of his adult life, but by 1977 his health had begun to fail, and the day-to-day work had fallen increasingly to their son William and their grandson Thomas. William was 52 years old, a quiet man who had inherited his mother's intensity, if not her sharp tongue. Thomas was 28, recently married, expecting his first child and looking forward to eventually taking over the farm that his family had worked for over a century. The 3 generations worked together smoothly, each knowing their role, each contributing to an operation that supported the entire extended family. The cattle theft that would trigger Granny Dollar's campaign occurred on a night in late March 1977, when a group of thieves backed trucks into the Dollar pastures and loaded 43 head of cattle, including 6 registered bulls and 15 breeding cows. The theft was professional, executed quickly and quietly, leaving behind nothing but tire tracks and broken fences. By the time William discovered the empty pastures the next morning, the cattle were already being processed through a slaughterhouse in Kentucky, reduced to anonymous beef that could never be traced back to the Dollar farm. And that's when the Dollar family learned what it meant to lose everything they had worked for. You see, the theft represented a financial catastrophe for the family. The 43 head were worth over $80,000 at 1977 prices, more money than most families in Park County would see in 5 years of work. Insurance covered only a fraction of the loss, and even that would take months to process. The registered animals, the foundation of a breeding program that had taken decades to develop, were simply gone, their bloodlines lost forever. The Dollar family faced the prospect of starting over from nothing, assuming they could even afford to continue farming at all. But the financial loss, devastating as it was not what drove Granny Dollar to action. It was the discovery 3 days after the theft that her grandson Thomas had been killed by the thieves when he apparently surprised them during the loading. His body was found in a drainage ditch a mile from the farm, shot twice in the chest, left like garbage by men who had valued cattle more than human life. Thomas, who had been expecting his first child in 4 months, who had planned to raise that child on the same land where 4 generations of his family had lived and worked. The sheriff's investigation moved slowly, hampered by a lack of witnesses and evidence that pointed in too many directions at once. The thieves had been careful, had worn gloves, had used stolen trucks that were later found burned in a field near the state line. The bullets that killed Thomas were from a common caliber that could have come from any of 1,000 guns. The few leads that developed went nowhere, dead ends that frustrated the investigators and tormented the family. After 2 weeks, the case had effectively stalled, and the sheriff admitted privately that he did not expect it to ever be solved. Granny Dollar attended her grandson's funeral with a face that showed nothing, that revealed nothing of the fires burning behind those pale blue eyes. She stood at the graveside while the minister spoke words that seemed inadequate to the occasion, while Thomas's pregnant wife Sarah wept uncontrollably, while the family gathered around a hole in the ground that represented the end of a young man's dreams. She did not weep, did not speak, did not show any of the emotions that those around her were displaying so openly. Those who watched her closely said later that what they saw in her face was not grief but calculation, the cold assessment of someone determining how a debt would be repaid. That night, after the funeral reception had ended and the last mourners had departed, Granny Dollar sat alone in the farmhouse kitchen where she had spent most of her 70 years and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. The law had failed to find Thomas's killers. The law would not deliver the justice that his death demanded. If justice was to be done, she would have to do it herself, with her own hands, in her own way. She would find the men who had stolen her cattle and killed her grandson, and she would make them pay with their lives. All of them. Every single one. And that vow, spoken in the silence of a kitchen that had witnessed 4 generations of Dollar family life, would be fulfilled beyond anything Granny Dollar herself could have imagined. You see, Granny Dollar had advantages that the sheriff's department lacked. She had lived in Park County her entire life, knew everyone, knew who was honest and who was not, knew the networks of rumor and gossip that connected every farm and every family. She had relationships that went back decades, people who would tell her things they would never tell a deputy with a badge. And she had time, all the time in the world, because retirement from farming had given her days that were no longer filled with the endless work that had defined her younger years. The investigation she conducted was patient and methodical, the work of a woman who had learned from a lifetime of farming that rushing never produced good results. She talked to neighbors, attended church socials, visited the feed stores and equipment dealers where farmers gathered to exchange news. She listened more than she spoke, asked questions that seemed innocent, filed away every piece of information that might eventually prove useful. Within a month, she knew more about the cattle theft ring operating in western Indiana than the state police had learned in a year of investigation. The network she uncovered was larger and more organized than anyone had suspected. At its center was a man named Carl Whitmore, a livestock dealer from Terre Haute who had legitimate businesses that served as cover for his real operation. Whitmore had connections to auction barns across 4 states, relationships with slaughterhouse operators who asked no questions, and a crew of men who could empty a pasture in an hour and leave no evidence behind. He had been operating for at least 5 years, stealing millions of dollars worth of cattle, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement through a combination of careful planning and well-placed bribes. The men who worked for Whitmore numbered over 30, a loose network of drivers and loaders and scouts who were paid in cash and knew better than to ask questions about where the cattle came from. Some were career criminals, men who had found in cattle theft a profitable alternative to the kinds of crimes that drew serious law enforcement attention. Others were farmers themselves, men who had fallen on hard times and had been recruited by the promise of easy money. All of them understood that they were part of something illegal, and all of them had accepted the risks that came with that understanding. Granny Dollar's investigation identified 21 men who had been directly involved in the theft from the Dollar farm and the murder of Thomas. The information came from multiple sources, pieced together over weeks of patient work, cross-referenced and verified until she was certain that she had the right names. These were the men who had driven the trucks, who had loaded the cattle, who had shot her grandson when he tried to stop them. These were the men who would pay for what they had done. The weapons she prepared for her campaign were an assortment of firearms that had accumulated on the Dollar farm over 4 generations. She had a 12-gauge shotgun that had belonged to her father, a deer rifle that Harold had used for decades, and a revolver that had been in a drawer since the 1940s. She cleaned and loaded each weapon with the same careful attention she had always brought to farm work, testing them to ensure they functioned properly, practicing until she was confident in her ability to use them effectively. Her hands might be gnarled with age, but they were still steady, and 70 years of shooting had made her a marksman that few younger people could match. The first killing came on a night in late April 1977, 1 month after Thomas's funeral. The target was a man named Billy Hawkins, one of the drivers who had been at the Dollar Farm the night of the theft. Hawkins lived alone in a trailer outside of Clinton, a man in his 30s who had been in and out of trouble his entire life, and who had finally found in cattle theft a crime that paid well enough to support his various addictions. He was drinking beer and watching television when Granny Dollar knocked on his door, and he died with a look of surprise on his face, unable to comprehend that the small, elderly woman standing before him was the last thing he would ever see. The killing was clean and efficient, a single shotgun blast that ended Billy Hawkins's life before he could react or resist. Granny Dollar felt nothing, no remorse, no satisfaction, simply the calm certainty that justice had been served and that 20 more debts remained to be paid. She left the body where it fell, made no attempt to hide what she had done, and drove back to the farm in time to watch the sunrise over fields that had been in her family for 4 generations. The death of Billy Hawkins was initially attributed to his lifestyle and his associations, assumed to be the result of a drug deal gone wrong or a dispute with one of his criminal acquaintances. The sheriff's department investigated briefly, found no obvious suspects, and moved on to other cases that seemed more pressing. No one connected the killing to the Dollar Farm theft. No one suspected that a 70-year-old grandmother might be responsible, and no one imagined that this death was only the first of many. That's right. Granny Dollar continued her campaign through the spring and into the summer, striking with a regularity that eventually forced even the most skeptical observers to acknowledge that something unusual was happening. The second killing came 2 weeks after the first, targeting another of the drivers from the theft. This man, named Jerry Caldwell, was found dead in his pickup truck on a country road, shot twice through the window while apparently waiting for someone who never arrived. The killing was clean and professional, suggesting planning and patience that the investigators found disturbing. The third followed 10 days later, claiming the life of a man named Robert Stinson, who had operated one of the trucks used to transport the Dollar cattle. Stinson had been more careful than the others, had started varying his routines and avoiding isolated locations. His caution had not been enough. Granny Dollar had found him at a gas station, had waited for a moment when no other customers were present, and had ended his life with a single shot that witnesses never heard. The fourth and fifth came in quick succession in early June, demonstrating that Granny Dollar's campaign was accelerating rather than slowing down. The fourth victim was a man who had served as a lookout during the Dollar theft, positioned at an intersection to warn if anyone approached. The fifth was one of Whitmore's recruiters, a man who had identified the Dollar Farm as a target and who had helped plan the theft. Both died within 48 hours of each other, both shot at close range, both found by people who had no idea what had happened or why. The pattern of the killings began to emerge to anyone who was paying attention. All the victims had connections to the cattle theft trade. All had operated in the region where Whitmore's network was strongest. All had died in ways that suggested careful planning and personal vengeance. Local sheriffs shared information, compared notes, began to suspect that they were dealing with something more organized than random violence. The state police were brought in, and the investigation expanded beyond anything a rural killing spree would normally warrant. Each killing demonstrated her evolution as a hunter of men. She learned which approaches were safest, which times offered the greatest opportunity, which methods attracted the least attention. She discovered that her age and her appearance were her greatest assets, that no one suspected a grandmother of being capable of cold-blooded murder, that she could approach targets who would have fled from a younger, more threatening figure. She moved through the world of rural Indiana like a ghost, invisible in plain sight, striking without warning and disappearing without a trace. The investigation into the killings took months to coalesce into a recognition that the deaths were connected. The victims were scattered across several counties, died in different ways, seemed to have nothing in common except their involvement in criminal activities. Different jurisdictions investigated different deaths, and communication between agencies was poor, as it often was in rural areas where sheriffs were more concerned with protecting their turf than with sharing information. It was a state police investigator named Detective James Morrison who finally noticed the pattern, who realized that all the dead men had connections to the cattle theft ring that Carl Whitmore operated. Morrison was a veteran investigator who had been assigned to the case after the state police were asked to assist with what local sheriffs were calling an unprecedented wave of rural violence. He had 20 years of experience with organized crime in Indianapolis, and he recognized the signs of a systematic campaign when he saw them. Morrison spent weeks reviewing case files, interviewing witnesses, building a database of connections between the victims. He mapped their relationships, identified their associates, traced the networks that connected them to each other and to Whitmore's operation. The picture that emerged was of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years, stealing cattle from dozens of families, processing the stolen animals through a network of corrupt auction barns and slaughterhouses. The picture also suggested that someone was systematically eliminating members of that network. Morrison began to suspect that someone was systematically eliminating members of the network, though he could not imagine who might be responsible or why. The killer seemed to have detailed knowledge of the network's operations, knew who had participated in specific thefts, knew where to find men who were trying to hide. The level of intelligence demonstrated by the killings suggested an inside source, someone who had access to information that ordinary outsiders could not have obtained. The sixth killing came in late June, followed by the seventh in early July. By midsummer 1977, 7 men were dead, and the cattle theft operation had effectively ceased, its members too frightened to continue their activities. Carl Whitmore himself had retreated to Terre Haute, surrounded himself with security, and stopped visiting the rural areas where his network had once operated freely. The man who had built a criminal empire on stolen cattle was now a prisoner of his own fear, unable to move, unable to work, unable to do anything except wait for the death that he knew was coming. The 8th and 9th killings came on the same night in late July, a double strike that demonstrated Granny Dollar's willingness to take risks when the opportunity presented itself. Both victims were men who had been present at the Dollar farm. Both had been identified by witnesses as having participated in loading the stolen cattle, and both died within hours of each other in locations 30 miles apart. The logistics of the double killing impressed Detective Morrison when he learned about it, suggested a level of planning and execution that seemed impossible for a single perpetrator. And that's when the investigation took a turn that no one had anticipated. You see, Detective Morrison had been working the case for months, building profiles of the victims, searching for connections that might reveal the killer's identity. He had assumed that the perpetrator was a man, probably young, probably connected to one of the criminal networks that competed with Whitmore's operation. The possibility that an elderly woman might be responsible had never crossed his mind until he received a tip from an unexpected source. The tip came from a farmer in Vermilion County who had recognized Granny Dollar's car near the scene of one of the killings. The farmer knew Dorothy Dollar, had done business with her family for years, and had been puzzled to see her driving alone at night in an area far from her home. He had thought nothing of it at the time, but when he heard about the killing that had occurred nearby, he felt obligated to report what he had seen. The report reached Detective Morrison, and suddenly a case that had seemed impossibly complex began to make a terrible kind of sense. Morrison investigated the tip carefully, not wanting to accuse a 70-year-old grandmother of multiple murders based on a single sighting. He looked into the Dollar family history, learned about the cattle theft and Thomas's murder, understood immediately the motive that might drive someone to seek revenge. He requested the case files on the Dollar theft, saw that the investigation had gone nowhere, realized that the family had been denied the justice that the system should have provided. He began to see Dorothy Dollar not as an unlikely suspect, but as the only suspect who made sense. The surveillance of Granny Dollar began in August 1977 and continued for 3 weeks without producing direct evidence of her involvement in the killings. She went about her daily routine, attended church, visited neighbors, seemed to be exactly what she appeared to be, an elderly widow living out her final years on the family farm. The deputies who watched her saw nothing suspicious, reported nothing unusual, began to doubt that the tip had any validity. Detective Morrison remained convinced that she was responsible, but could not prove it. And that's when the 10th killing occurred, on a night when Granny Dollar had been under surveillance the entire time. You see, Granny Dollar had known about the surveillance almost from the moment it began. She had lived in Park County her entire life, knew every car and every face, noticed immediately when strangers began appearing in places where they did not belong. She had spotted the watchers within days and had immediately understood what their presence meant. Rather than stopping her campaign, she had adapted it, finding ways to strike that the surveillance could not detect. The killing that baffled the investigators was accomplished with the help of her son William, who had known from the beginning what his mother was doing and had supported her without reservation. Thomas had been his son, his only son, and he shared his mother's conviction that the killers deserved to die. While the deputies watched Granny Dollar's movements, William drove to the target's location and committed the killing that his mother had planned. The surveillance proved nothing except that Dorothy Dollar had not left her property that night, which only deepened the mystery of who was responsible for the deaths. The 11th and 12th killings followed the same pattern, with William acting as his mother's agent, while she maintained the appearance of innocence under the watchful eyes of the surveillance team. Detective Morrison suspected that the Dollar family was working together, but could not prove it, could not explain how the killings continued, while his primary suspect was being watched around the clock. The case became an obsession for him, a puzzle that seemed to have no solution. The surveillance was eventually withdrawn in September 1977, the department unable to justify the resources for an operation that was producing no results. Granny Dollar waited 2 weeks after the watchers departed, then resumed her campaign personally. The 13th killing came on a night in early October, targeting one of Whitmore's lieutenants, a man who had helped plan the theft that had started everything. The 14th followed 2 weeks later. The 15th came on the anniversary of Thomas's death, a symbolic date that Granny Dollar had marked from the beginning. By late 1977, 15 men were dead, and Carl Whitmore's operation had been completely destroyed. The surviving members of his network had scattered, fled to other states, abandoned the cattle theft business entirely. Whitmore himself had tried to negotiate with whoever was hunting his men, had offered money, had offered information about other criminals, had offered anything he could think of to save his life. His offers were ignored, his pleas unheard, his fate as certain as that of the men who had already died. The 16th and 17th killings came in early 1978, reducing the list of targets to a handful of survivors who were doing everything in their power to disappear. Some had changed their names, moved to distant cities, tried to erase any connection to their former lives. Granny Dollar found them anyway, tracked them through networks that she had built over decades of life in rural Indiana, followed trails that would have been invisible to anyone who had not grown up in this world of farmers and small towns, where everyone knew everyone else's business. The 18th killing came in March 1978, exactly 1 year after the theft that had started everything. The 19th followed in April. The 20th came in May. Each death brought Granny Dollar closer to the completion of her mission, closer to the moment when she could finally rest, when Thomas's death would finally be fully avenged. Carl Whitmore, the man who had built the empire that had destroyed her family, was the 21st and final target. Granny Dollar had saved him for last, had wanted him to experience the fear of knowing that death was coming, of watching his organization destroyed piece by piece, of understanding that nothing he could do would save him. She found him in June 1978, hiding in a cabin near Turkey Run State Park, protected by guards who proved inadequate to the task. The killing of Carl Whitmore was different from the others, longer and more deliberate, a final statement that Granny Dollar wanted to make before her campaign ended. She incapacitated his guards with the same efficiency she had shown throughout her campaign, then spent several hours with Whitmore before finally ending his life. What passed between them during those hours was never recorded, known only to Granny Dollar and to the man she killed. When Whitmore's body was found the next morning, the expression on his face suggested that his final hours had not been peaceful. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the campaign ended. Granny Dollar was arrested 3 days after Carl Whitmore's death, charged with 21 counts of first-degree murder, based on evidence that Detective Morrison had accumulated over more than a year of investigation. The case against her was strong, built on witness statements, physical evidence, and the testimony of family members who had finally been compelled to speak. She did not resist arrest, did not attempt to flee, seemed almost relieved that her work was finished, and that she could finally stop hiding. The trial of Dorothy Mae Dollar became the most sensational criminal proceeding in Indiana history, drawing national media attention and spectators who traveled from across the country to witness the proceedings. The courthouse in Rockville was packed every day, with crowds gathering outside to hear reports from those who had secured seats inside. Network news crews set up positions on the courthouse lawn, filing reports that made the trial a topic of conversation across America. The prosecution was led by a young assistant state attorney named Michael Patterson, who had been given the case because more senior prosecutors wanted nothing to do with a proceeding that seemed certain to generate sympathy for the defendant. Patterson was ambitious and talented, and he approached the case with a determination to secure conviction regardless of the public sentiment that seemed to favor Granny Dollar. He spent months preparing, interviewing witnesses, organizing evidence, building a case that he believed was legally unassailable. The defense team was led by a veteran attorney named Howard Nichols, who had practiced law in Park County for over 40 years and who had known the Dollar family his entire career. Nichols had taken the case without fee, convinced that Dorothy Dollar deserved the best defense possible, regardless of whether she could afford to pay for it. He was assisted by his daughter Martha, a young attorney who had recently joined his practice and who brought energy and passion to a case that seemed to define everything her father had taught her about justice. The prosecution presented its case methodically, describing each killing in detail, connecting Granny Dollar to the deaths through a web of evidence that seemed overwhelming. They called witnesses who had seen her car near crime scenes, who had sold her ammunition, who had noticed her unusual travels in the months before her arrest. They presented ballistic evidence, linking bullets from the killings to weapons found on the Dollar farm. They showed photographs of the crime scenes, read autopsy reports that described the violence that had been inflicted, tried to establish that the killings had been planned and executed with cold-blooded efficiency. They portrayed her as a cold-blooded killer, a woman who had murdered 21 men in calculated revenge, who had shown no mercy and no hesitation. The defense argued that Granny Dollar had been driven to her actions by circumstances that left her no other choice. They described the theft that had devastated her family, the murder of her grandson that had shattered her world, the failure of law enforcement to deliver the justice that Thomas's death demanded. They presented witnesses who testified to the brutality of Whitmore's operation, families who had suffered similar losses, evidence of the crimes that the dead men had committed. They asked the jury to understand, if not to forgive, what Dorothy Dollar had done. The prosecution called expert witnesses who testified about the planning and sophistication that the killings had required, who argued that Granny Dollar had acted with premeditation and purpose that exceeded anything that could be explained by grief. They showed photographs of the crime scenes, read autopsy reports that described the violence that had been inflicted, tried to counter the sympathy that the defense had generated with the cold reality of 21 deaths. The defense countered with witnesses who testified to Dorothy Dollar's character, to her decades of service to her community, to the unimaginable loss that had driven her to action. Thomas's widow Sarah testified about the baby that had been born 3 months after his death, a little girl who would never know her father, who had been denied his presence because men had valued cattle more than human life. The testimony moved many in the courtroom to tears, including several members of the jury. The jury deliberated for 6 days, longer than anyone had expected, suggesting that the decision was not as straightforward as either side had hoped. When they finally returned, their verdict reflected the complexity of the case and the impossibility of simple judgments. Guilty of voluntary manslaughter on 21 counts, with a recommendation for the minimum possible sentence. The verdict was a compromise, an acknowledgement that Granny Dollar had committed terrible acts while simultaneously recognizing the circumstances that had driven her to them. The judge, an elderly man named Walter Harrison, who had known the Dollar family for decades, sentenced her to 21 concurrent terms of 10 years each, with eligibility for parole after 7 years. It was the most lenient sentence the law would allow, and it still meant that Dorothy Dollar would spend her final years in prison. Granny Dollar accepted the verdict without visible emotion, the same composure she had maintained throughout the trial. She was transported to the Indiana Women's Prison in Indianapolis, where she would remain until her death in 1985 at the age of 78. She never expressed remorse for the killings, never recanted her belief that the men she killed had deserved to die, never wavered in her conviction that she had delivered justice where the system had failed. Her years in prison were quiet and uneventful, marked by the same discipline and determination that had characterized her entire life. She followed the rules, caused no trouble, earned the respect of guards and inmates alike through her composure and her refusal to complain about her circumstances. She spent her days reading, writing letters to her family, and maintaining the connections that had sustained her throughout her life. The other inmates treated her with a deference that bordered on reverence, understanding that the elderly woman in their midst was not like the other prisoners. She received regular visits from her family, who made the trip to Indianapolis as often as regulations allowed. William came most frequently, bringing news of the farm and photographs of the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who were growing up without her. Sarah brought baby Dorothy when she was old enough to travel, and Granny Dollar held her namesake through the glass that separated prisoners from visitors, unable to touch the child, but able to see the future of the family she had fought to protect. The letters she wrote from prison were preserved by her family and provide insight into her state of mind during those final years. She wrote about the farm, about the weather, about the small details of daily life that connected her to the world she had left behind. She never wrote about the killings, never mentioned the trial, seemed determined to leave that chapter of her life closed. The letters showed a woman at peace with her decisions, accepting of her circumstances, focused on the future rather than the past. Her health declined gradually over the years, the inevitable consequence of age and the stress of incarceration. She developed heart problems that required treatment, struggled with arthritis that made movement painful, experienced the slow deterioration that awaits everyone who lives long enough. The prison medical staff did what they could, but they were not equipped to provide the kind of care that her conditions eventually required. She died on a cold January night in 1985, alone in her cell, having refused to be transferred to a hospital when her final decline began. The guards who found her body reported that she looked peaceful, that whatever pain she had experienced in her final hours had left no mark on her face. She was buried beside Thomas 3 days later, in a funeral that drew hundreds of mourners despite the winter weather. The aftermath of Granny Dollar's campaign reshaped the cattle industry in Indiana and beyond. The exposure of Whitmore's operation, which came out in detail during the trial, led to reforms in how livestock was tracked and sold. State legislators who had ignored the cattle theft crisis for years suddenly found themselves under pressure to act, as the trial had made clear how serious the problem had become and how badly the existing systems had failed. New regulations required more rigorous documentation of cattle ownership, making it harder for stolen animals to be sold through legitimate channels. Auction barns were required to verify the identity of sellers and to report suspicious transactions. Slaughterhouses faced new inspection regimes designed to catch stolen cattle before they could be processed. The changes added costs and complications to the cattle business, but most farmers accepted them as necessary responses to a crisis that had been allowed to fester for too long. Law enforcement agencies throughout the Midwest reviewed their procedures for investigating livestock theft, recognizing that the failures that had allowed Whitmore to operate for so long represented systemic problems that needed to be addressed. New training programs were developed, new coordination mechanisms were established, new resources were devoted to rural crime that had previously been considered a low priority. The death of 21 men had demonstrated that rural crimes could have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate harm they caused. New regulations made it harder for stolen cattle to be moved through legitimate channels. New enforcement mechanisms gave law enforcement better tools to pursue theft rings. The changes did not eliminate cattle theft, but they made it significantly harder and significantly riskier. The era of organized cattle theft operations like Whitmore's largely ended, though individual thefts continued to occur as they always had. The families who had lost cattle to Whitmore's operation received a measure of justice through civil proceedings, that followed the criminal trial. Whitmore's assets were seized and distributed to his victims, providing compensation that could not replace what had been lost, but that at least acknowledged the harm that had been done. The Dollar family received the largest settlement, though the money meant nothing to them compared to the grandson they had lost. William Dollar continued to operate the family farm after his mother's imprisonment, maintaining the operation that 4 generations had built. He visited his mother regularly in prison, bringing news of the farm and the family, maintaining the connection that had sustained them throughout the ordeal. He never publicly discussed his role in the killings, never confirmed or denied the assistance he had provided, and went to his grave in 1992 with whatever secrets he carried. The baby that Thomas Dollar never met grew up on the family farm, raised by her mother and her extended family, surrounded by people who told her stories about the father she had never known, and the grandmother who had avenged his death. She was named Dorothy, after the grandmother who was in prison when she was born, and she grew up to be a strong and determined woman who embodied the best qualities of both her namesakes. She still lives on the Dollar farm today, the 5th generation to work that land. The grave of Thomas Dollar became something of a pilgrimage site in the years following the trial, visited by people who wanted to pay their respects to the young man whose death had sparked such extraordinary events. The stone that marks his resting place bears his name and dates and a simple inscription, "Beloved son, husband, and father." Next to his grave is a space that was reserved for his grandmother, who was buried there in 1985 after her death in prison. The family placed them together, the grandson and the grandmother, united in death as they had been united in the events that defined both their lives. The story of Granny Dollar passed into legend almost immediately, becoming one of those tales that rural people told at gatherings and passed down through generations. Songs were written about her, ballads that celebrated her determination and mourned the death of Thomas. Some portrayed her as a hero who had defended her family when the law could not. Others painted her as a dangerous vigilante who had taken justice into her own hands with terrible results. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any simple narrative could capture. The songs that emerged from the Granny Dollar story varied widely in their approach and message. Some were straightforward country ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, beginning with the cattle theft and ending with the trial. These songs celebrated her resolve, described her campaign in detail, portrayed her as a symbol of rural values and rural justice. They found audiences throughout rural America, sung in honky-tonks and at county fairs, becoming part of the cultural fabric of communities that understood the world Granny Dollar had inhabited. Others focused on the relationship between grandmother and grandson, imagining conversations they had shared, dreams that Thomas had for his future, the love that had transformed into something terrible when it was violated. These songs were more sentimental, designed to move audiences to tears, to capture the human cost of what had happened. They reminded listeners that behind the body count and the legal proceedings was a family that had lost something precious, a grandmother who had loved her grandson with a fierceness that the world had rarely seen. One popular song described the night when Granny Dollar made her decision, sitting alone in the farmhouse kitchen after Thomas's funeral, surrounded by the memories of 4 generations. The song captured the silence of that moment, the weight of what she was contemplating, the transformation from grieving grandmother to calculating hunter. It portrayed her not as a monster, but as a woman pushed beyond all reasonable limits, making a choice that no one should ever have to make. Another song told the story from the perspective of Carl Whitmore, describing his growing terror as his men died one by one around him. This song was darker than most, capturing the fear that must have consumed a man who understood that death was hunting him, and that nothing he could do would prevent it from finding him. It portrayed his final hours in graphic detail, imagining the conversation that might have passed between him and Granny Dollar before she ended his life. A third song focused on Detective Morrison and his investigation, describing the frustration of pursuing a killer who seemed to be invisible, who struck without warning and disappeared without a trace. The song portrayed the detective as sympathetic, a man trying to do his job while understanding on some level that the woman he was hunting had been failed by the system he represented. It captured the moral complexity of the case, the difficulty of pursuing justice against someone who had been denied it. One popular song described the moment when Granny Dollar learned of Thomas's death, painting a picture of the elderly woman receiving the news, of the transformation that occurred in her eyes as grief became rage and rage became resolve. The song captured the silence of that moment, the stillness before the storm, the decision that would lead to 21 deaths and the destruction of a criminal empire. It became a favorite at rural gatherings, sung by voices that understood what it meant to lose everything and to demand that the debt be paid. Another song told the story from the perspective of the investigators, describing their growing frustration as the killings continued and their primary suspect seemed impossible to catch. This song portrayed Granny Dollar as almost supernatural, an avenging angel who could not be stopped by ordinary means, who moved through the world invisible and unstoppable. It captured the fear that must have gripped the survivors of Whitmore's network, men who understood that death was hunting them, and that nothing they could do would prevent it from finding them. The most famous of these songs, known as Granny's Reckoning, was composed in 1980 by a songwriter who had attended the trial and been moved by what he witnessed. The song was over 15 verses long, telling the complete story with detail that suggested careful research and deep understanding. It has been performed by country artists for over 4 decades, has been covered dozens of times, and remains a staple of rural American music. Historians and criminologists who have studied the Granny Dollar case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of vigilante justice, a demonstration of what can happen when official institutions fail to protect the people they serve. Others have focused on the gender dimensions of the case, noting that Granny Dollar's age and appearance allowed her to operate in ways that would have been impossible for a younger or male perpetrator. Still others have examined the economic context, seeing in the cattle theft crisis a symptom of the broader agricultural collapse that was devastating rural America in the 1970s. You see, what Granny Dollar did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. She killed 21 men, most of them shot without warning, without any opportunity to surrender or defend themselves. The fact that her victims were criminals who had committed terrible acts does not eliminate the fact that she acted as judge, jury, and executioner, taking lives that were not hers to take. Any society that hopes to maintain order must condemn vigilante killing regardless of the grievances that motivate it. And yet her story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that murder is wrong. She was a grandmother whose grandson had been shot down by men who faced no accountability through official channels. The system that should have protected Thomas had failed him. The investigation that should have found his killers had gone nowhere. There was no legitimate avenue for redress, no institution that would hold the murderers accountable. What options did she have? What would any grandmother do when faced with such impossible loss and such complete absence of justice? Her story challenges us to consider the relationship between law and justice, between what is legal and what is right. The men she killed were criminals, some of them violent criminals, all of them participants in an enterprise that had caused enormous harm to innocent people. They had stolen from families who could not afford the loss, had killed a young man who had done nothing except try to protect his family's property. The legal system had failed to hold them accountable, had allowed them to continue their depredations without consequence. Dorothy Dollar created accountability where none existed, demonstrated that crime had consequences, and destroyed an organization that had preyed on rural families for years. The specific circumstances that produced the Granny Dollar story have changed in the decades since those events occurred. Cattle theft remains a problem in rural America, but improved tracking systems and better coordination between law enforcement agencies have made it easier to catch and prosecute thieves. The kind of organized network that Carl Whitmore built would be harder to maintain today, though not impossible. The possibility of a theft ring operating for years without serious interference from law enforcement seems less likely now than it was in 1977, but the underlying questions that her story raises have not disappeared entirely. Law enforcement still sometimes fails to protect rural communities. Criminals still sometimes escape accountability. The gap between what the law promises and what it delivers remains wide enough to generate rage and despair in those who find themselves on the wrong side of that gap. The story of Granny Dollar serves as a reminder of what can happen when that gap becomes unbridgeable, when grandmothers lose faith in institutions that are supposed to protect their families. The descendants of Dorothy Dollar still farm that land in Park County, carrying a name that evokes both pride and complexity. The farm has passed through 5 generations now, still raising cattle, still growing corn, still maintaining the traditions that have defined the family since the 1840s. The current generation knows the story of Granny Dollar, has heard it told at family gatherings, understands the weight of carrying a name that is known throughout Indiana for events that occurred before most of them were born. The family has maintained the farm through good years and bad, through droughts and floods and the endless economic pressures that have driven so many families off the land. They have modernized where necessary, adopting new technologies and new methods while preserving the fundamental character of the operation. The cattle herd has been rebuilt to its former size, though the bloodlines that were stolen in 1977 could never be recovered. The fields produce crops that are sold on markets their ancestors could not have imagined. Dorothy, the great-granddaughter who was named for Granny Dollar and was born 3 months after Thomas's death, has become the unofficial keeper of the family history. She has collected documents, photographs, and recordings of family members telling stories about the events of 1977 and 1978. She has compiled everything into an archive that future generations will be able to consult, ensuring that the story will not be lost as the people who lived through it pass away. Family reunions are held annually on the Dollar Farm, gatherings that bring together descendants from across the Midwest and beyond. At these reunions, the story of Granny Dollar is told to children who might otherwise forget, the details preserved through oral tradition, as they have been for over 4 decades. These gatherings are part celebration and part memorial, acknowledging both the joyful connections of family and the tragic events that have shaped that family's identity. The older members share stories about Thomas, about Granny Dollar, about the world that existed before the theft changed everything. The younger members listen with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, understanding that they are connected to events that are both heroic and terrible. The older members of the family can describe each killing, can explain the circumstances that led to each death, can recount the trial and the verdict that followed. They know details that never made it into the official records, information that has been passed down through family channels and preserved in the collective memory of the Dollars. They understand that their ancestor did something that the law condemns, something that involved taking human life on a scale that defies ordinary comprehension. But they also understand why she did it, and that understanding has shaped their relationship with justice and authority in ways that outsiders can only partially grasp. The Dollar Farm today looks much as it did in 1977, the barns and fences maintained with the same care that has always characterized the operation. The cattle herd has been rebuilt, though the registered Angus bloodlines that were stolen were never recovered. The fields produce corn and soybeans that are sold at markets throughout the region. Life goes on as it always does, the rhythms of planting and harvest continuing regardless of the human dramas that unfold against their backdrop. The site where Thomas Dollar's body was found has been marked with a simple stone that the family placed there in 1978 after the trial concluded. The stone bears no inscription, just the date of his death, but those who know the story understand what it represents. Visitors to the area sometimes stop there, drawn by the legend that has grown around the events of 1977 and 1978, wanting to see for themselves the place where a young man's death set in motion a campaign of vengeance that would claim 21 lives. The farmhouse where Dorothy Dollar sat and made her decision still stands, still occupied by members of the family, still the center of an operation that continues the work of 4 previous generations. The kitchen where she loaded her weapons is now a modern space with contemporary appliances, but the bones of the original room remain, the same walls that witnessed her preparation for a campaign that would make her name infamous. The covered bridges of Park County that draw tourists from across the country are just miles from the Dollar Farm, picturesque structures that represent a more innocent vision of rural Indiana. The tourists who visit them rarely know about the events that occurred nearby, rarely understand that the peaceful farmland they drive through was once the site of the bloodiest vigilante campaign in modern American history. The contrast between the pastoral beauty of the landscape and the violence of its history captures something essential about rural America, about the way appearances can deceive, and about the passions that can lurk beneath the surface of quiet lives. The story of Granny Dollar endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of family and what we will do to protect those we love, what we become when the people we cherish are taken from us. It is the story of justice and what happens when official channels fail to provide it, when the systems we trust to protect us instead abandon us. It is the story of determination and patience, of rage contained until it could be released with devastating effect upon those who had earned it. It is, finally, a story without easy answers, a tale that resists simple judgments and invites reflection on questions that have no comfortable resolution. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Granny Dollar stood? To see the farm where her family has lived for 5 generations? To visit the graves where she and Thomas rest together? Would you walk the fields that have witnessed so much history, breathe the Indiana air that still carries the scent of corn and cattle and the memories of generations past, feel the same wind that has blown across these plains since before any European set foot here? The journey is easy enough, the roads well maintained, the farm accessible to anyone who wants to see it. The covered bridges are beautiful in autumn when the leaves change, and the farmland stretches to the horizon in every direction, peaceful and prosperous and giving no hint of the violence that once exploded across it. But those who make the effort say that standing in that place and knowing that history brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs, they say that the land itself seems to hold the memory of what happened, that walking the fields where Thomas died and where Granny Dollar planned her campaign creates a connection to the past that nothing else can provide. They say that understanding the story requires seeing the place, requires feeling the earth beneath your feet, requires standing where she stood and imagining what she must have felt. The flat farmland of Park County keeps its secrets well, holding the memory of Granny Dollar close, like it holds the morning mist and the evening shadows, and the countless other stories of those who have lived and worked this land for generations. Her story will continue to be told, as long as people remember what happened in Indiana in those terrible years, as long as families value their own and protect what belongs to them, as long as systems fail and ordinary people find ways to respond. She is gone now, buried beside the grandson whose death she avenged, but what she did echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. The woman who had lived her entire life on the same farm, who had raised children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren on that land, who had never traveled far from the county where she was born, became in her final years a figure of national significance, a symbol of something that people recognized even if they could not quite name it. The covered bridges that draw tourists to Park County every fall stand as silent witnesses to a history that most visitors never learn. The peaceful farmland that stretches in every direction hides stories of violence and vengeance that seem impossible in such a pastoral setting. The contrast between appearance and reality, between the beauty of the landscape and the darkness of its history, captures something essential about rural America, about the passions that can lurk beneath the surface of quiet lives. And that, my friend, is the true story of Dorothy Mae Dollar, Granny Dollar, who slaughtered 21 men after they stole her family's cattle and killed her grandson Thomas in a drainage ditch a mile from the farm where 5 generations of his family had lived and worked and died. A story of love and loss, of blood and determination, of a grandmother's righteous fury, of justice found where the law could not and would not provide it. The farmland remembers her and her terrible deeds, and through it, so do we all, now and forever.